July 1st, 1942. A coastal gun fort on the edge of the Black Sea fires its last shell. 2 armored turrets, each holding a 305mm naval gun. For 8 months they have been part of the reason a city the Germans called unconquerable has not fallen. The magazines are empty now. There is no more ammunition to bring up. The crews inside already know what comes next. 2,000 kilometers away, the men who gave the order to fight here are not here to see it. By the time the last shell leaves the barrel, the admiral and the general who commanded this defense are already gone, flown out, sailed out, in full view of the soldiers they left behind. What's left is a strip of rock at the edge of the sea, a few thousand exhausted men, and a gun that has nothing left to give them. This is not the story of the siege of Sevastopol. That story, 250 days, the longest siege the Soviet Union endured, has been told many times. This is the story of what happened in its last 9 days. The fortress that fired until it had nothing left to fire. The men who blew up their own guns rather than hand them over. And the tens of thousands left on a strip of rock by the sea, waiting for ships that were never going to come. For decades, the Soviet Union mostly chose not to talk about this part. This is the last gun, and the men who were standing next to it. By the summer of 1942, Sevastopol had been under siege longer than almost any city in the war. It began on the 30th of October, 1941, when Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's 11th Army reached the outskirts of the Black Sea Fleet's main base and found a fortress city built into limestone hills, ringed with forts, and defended by men who had no intention of giving it up. For 250 days, they didn't. Through a winter siege, through a failed German assault in December, through a Soviet counterlanding at Kerch that briefly threatened to unravel the whole German position in Crimea, Sevastopol held. The city had become something close to a symbol on both sides, proof to the Soviets that the Germans could be stopped, proof to Hitler that this war could still be won quickly if enough force was brought to bear in one place. By June of 1942, Hitler had decided he was done waiting. On June 2nd, 1942, Manstein opened his final assault with the largest concentration of artillery the German army had ever assembled in one place. Roughly 1,300 guns and 700 mortars in 121 batteries. At Hitler's personal insistence, the heaviest weapons ever built rolled in on railway tracks. The 800mm gun nicknamed Dora, so large it needed 500 men just to operate it, firing shells that weighed 7 tons apiece. One round reportedly punched through 100 feet of solid rock and the floor of a bay to destroy a Soviet ammunition depot from above. Dora's accuracy was poor. Her real effect was psychological. The sound and the scale of something that size, fired at human beings. What actually mattered were 2 Soviet coastal forts the Germans had nicknamed for a Russian writer, Battery 30 on the city's north side, and Battery 35 near Cape Chersonese to the south. Twin steel turrets, each housing 2 305mm naval guns in armor, thick enough to shrug off most of what the Germans could throw at them. Both forts had begun life decades earlier, under the last Tsar, before revolution and civil war stalled construction for years. For 8 months, finished at last, they had been the reason Sevastopol's harbor stayed Soviet. 2 men ran Sevastopol's defense. Vice Admiral Philip Oktyabrski, commander of the Black Sea Fleet, held overall authority. Lieutenant General Ivan Petrov commanded the ground troops, the coastal army, who had done the actual dying, dug into the hills for 8 months. Both men had earned real respect from the men under them. Petrov in particular was known as a soldier's general, visible at the front, careful with his men's lives where he could be, the kind of commander soldiers said they'd follow into anything. Neither of them would be in Sevastopol when it finally fell. By the last week of June, the German amphibious crossing of Severnaya Bay, more than 100 small boats, slipping across at night, had broken through the last organized line north of the city. Sevastopol's defense was collapsing by the day. At 10 minutes to 10 in the morning on June 30th, 1942, Moscow gave the order, evacuate Sevastopol. But the order from Stavka authorized the evacuation only of senior commanders and key specialists. Not the army, not the wounded, not the tens of thousands of men who had spent 8 months in these trenches, eating worse every week, watching the perimeter shrink a little further every day. The men giving that order were not the men who would have to explain it to the soldiers left behind. That night, General Petrov left by submarine. By most accounts, he went reluctantly. Some sources describe him having to be talked out of staying behind to die with his men rather than leave them. The next morning, July 1st, Admiral Oktyabrski was flown out by seaplane from an airstrip near the 35th Battery, in full view of the soldiers still holding the perimeter around that airstrip. Imagine standing in a foxhole, out of food, almost out of ammunition, and watching the men who commanded you lift off the ground and fly away, while you stay. There was no announcement, no explanation given to the men on the line, just the sound of an aircraft engine, and then its absence, and the slow realization spreading down the trench line of exactly what that absence meant. Command of what remained fell to Major General Pyotr Novikov, commander of the 109th Rifle Division, a man most viewers have never heard of, because history mostly hasn't bothered to remember him. Novikov was not a famous general. He hadn't asked for this command, and almost nothing about his career to that point had prepared him to inherit a collapsing fortress city with no senior officers left to answer to, and no plan handed down for what to do next. He pulled the survivors back onto Cape Chersonese, a narrow limestone peninsula at the very southwestern tip of Crimea, the last scrap of ground before open sea. He organized a perimeter anchored on the 35th Battery, and he tried to do something almost no one in his position had the resources to actually pull off. He tried to build a Dunkirk. 2 years earlier, the British had pulled 330,000 men off a beach at Dunkirk, under fire, because they had the ships, the air cover, and just enough time. Novikov had none of those things. The Luftwaffe owned the sky over Chersonese. The handful of submarines and small craft the Black Sea Fleet still had were already spent. One destroyer, the Tashkent, had survived more than 40 supply runs into Sevastopol across the whole siege, before finally being sunk by dive bombers on what turned out to be nearly its last trip out. A submarine had gone down on a resupply run just days earlier. There would be no fleet of little ships. There would be, at most, a handful of submarines slipping in at night, lifting out a few hundred men at a time, at enormous risk, while tens of thousands waited on the rocks behind them, with nowhere left to go but the water. Every man on that cape understood the arithmetic. A few hundred seats, tens of thousands of men. Most of them were never getting on a boat at all. If you made it this far, you're one of us. Hit subscribe and like. We unbury history every week. Now, back to our story. On July 1st, 1942, the same day Oktyabrski flew out, the 35th Battery fired its last 305mm shell. The magazines that had fed these guns through 8 months of siege were finally completely empty. There was no more ammunition coming. There never would be again. For a fortress that had helped hold a city for 250 days, it ended not with a dramatic last battle, but with the simple mechanical fact of running out. Before he left, Oktyabrski had given one more order. Once the ammunition was gone, destroy the guns. Don't let them fall into German hands. On the night of July 1st into the 2nd, the battery's crews packed the breeches and mechanisms of both turrets with explosives, along with the power station that ran them, and blew their own fortress apart from the inside. According to later accounts, it was the battery's assistant commander who saw the demolition through to the end, after the battery's nominal commander's own conduct in those final hours drew sharp criticism in the retelling. The details of exactly who did what in that chaos are still argued over. What isn't argued over is the outcome. By dawn on July 2nd, the guns that had anchored Sevastopol's southern defense for 8 months were scrap metal and broken concrete. The crews who'd fired that last round were the same crews who tore the fort apart with their own hands rather than let it be taken whole, packing their own gun deck with charges, then walking out into a battle they no longer had a weapon to fight with. 2 days later, on the night of July 2nd, Novikov made his own attempt to get off the Cape, boarding a small subchaser with a handful of other officers, hoping to slip past the German blockade in the dark. He didn't make it. German motor torpedo boats intercepted his vessel off the coast near Yalta. In the firefight that followed, his boat went down. Novikov was pulled out of the water and taken prisoner. The man who had been left holding Sevastopol's last defense became, within 48 hours, a prisoner of the army he'd been trying to hold off. He would not see the Soviet Union again. On July 4, 1942, German and Romanian troops stormed what remained of the Chersonese perimeter. This is worth saying plainly, because it's usually left out. A large share of that final assault was Romanian, not German. Romanian mountain troops pushed through the hills southeast of the city. One Romanian division alone took 10,000 prisoners in 3 days. This was not only a German victory. By the end of that day, by Western tallies, roughly 30,000 Soviet soldiers had surrendered on the Cape. Manstein declared Sevastopol fallen. In Berlin, it would be celebrated as one of the great sieges of the war, a fortress city taken at last, after 8 months that had cost the Germans and Romanians together more than 35,000 casualties in this final push alone. The fighting wasn't actually over. For days after Sevastopol fell, scattered groups of Soviet soldiers kept fighting from the caves, quarries, and bunkers riddling the limestone of Cape Chersonese, out of food, often out of ammunition, with the sea at their backs and nowhere left to retreat to. Some accounts describe organized resistance lasting until July 9th. Isolated stragglers held out or were hunted down even after that. There was no surrender ceremony. There was just a slow, grinding end, cave by cave, on a strip of rock barely big enough to hold the people stranded on it. The July sun overhead, the wounded going untreated, men deciding one by one between captivity and the sea behind them. Here's the part that's genuinely hard to pin down and worth being honest about. Nobody fully agrees on how many men were trapped on that cape. The lowest estimate, the number of men still in the city itself when the evacuation order came, runs around 23,000. Other tallies, counting everyone eventually pushed back onto Chersonese and captured in the final week, run far higher, by some counts, past 80,000. What every source agrees on is the shape of it, not the exact size. A very large number of men, abandoned by the command structure that had led them for 8 months, with no realistic way off that strip of land. Across the whole final assault, Axis losses ran past 35,000. Soviet losses, in that same final stretch, are estimated at well over 100,000 killed, wounded, or captured, on top of everything already lost in the 8 months before it. Novikov spent the next 2 years in German captivity, first at Hammelburg, then from December 1942 at the Flossenburg concentration camp. In August 1944, he was killed by camp guards. According to post-war testimony from a fellow prisoner, he was beaten to death with a stool near the furnace of one of the camp's blocks. Killed, by that account, for refusing to cooperate with the men holding him. He is one of a small number of Soviet generals who went to their deaths in German captivity rather than collaborate. His name is barely known outside specialist military history. No statue in Moscow, no chapter in the popular accounts. He held the line at Sevastopol after the men who outranked him had already left, and it cost him everything. After the war, the official Soviet story of Sevastopol became one of heroic, unbroken defense, 8 months of sacrifice, told and retold as a triumph of will. In Oktyabrski's own later accounts of that heroic defense, Petrov's name was largely left out. The abandonment of the garrison, the admiral flying away in view of his men, the tens of thousands left with no evacuation plan, didn't fit the story the state wanted to tell. For decades, this wasn't really a secret, exactly. It was just a part of the story nobody in an official position chose to tell. Not buried in a vault, just quietly left out of every speech, every textbook chapter, every anniversary broadcast, until the silence did the same work that a lie would have. Today, the 35th Battery is a memorial complex. Underground casemates preserved exactly as they were, open to the public, built up over the years following the early 2000s. At its center stands the Pantheon of Memory, opened in 2011, a structure shaped, deliberately, like a destroyed gun turret. Carved into it are the names of roughly 27,000 of Sevastopol's last defenders. While the memorial was being built, workers recovered more than 150 sets of remains from the ground around the battery. Soldiers and civilians who had died there in 1942 and been left where they fell. They were buried, finally, at the Pantheon, given a grave, 7 decades late, on the same ground where they had fallen. There's one more detail worth sitting with. The ruins of the 35th Battery stand a short walk from the ruins of Chersonesos, a Greek port city founded on this same cape 2,500 years ago, when this stretch of coastline was a democracy of traders and stonemasons, not a battlefield. 2,500 years of history, and one small piece of rock by the sea, has now buried 2 endings on the same ground, an ancient city's slow fade and a modern army's sudden one. The last gun fired on July 1st, 1942. The men who fired it blew it apart rather than hand it over, and the men left behind it were, for a long time, almost written out of the story entirely. This is the story the silence left out.